Earth stayed silent in the council until it was time to strike. The vote was already halfway done before I sat down. I could feel it in the room the way you feel a storm before the first drop of rain hits the ground. 214 delegates packed into the grand chamber, and not one of them was looking at me. They never looked at me. That was the point. I was Commander Yusra Khalid, Senior Attaché for the Earth delegation to the Galactic Conclave, and in 6 years of sitting in this hall, I had not said a single word on the record. Not one. The presiding chair, a tall, iridescent creature called Delegate Voron of the Solving Collective, was moving through the preliminary motions at a pace that told me everything. He was rushing. You only rush when you are afraid someone will notice what you are doing before it is finished. I noticed. To my left, my assistant Oliver Nash leaned in close and kept his voice low. "The block has the numbers," he said. "Our count puts them at 34 confirmed votes. They only need 30. "I know," I said. "Yusra," he paused. "This is it. If this clause passes, we are locked out permanently. No voting rights. No standing to propose legislation. Earth becomes a guest in a room we technically belong to." I looked straight ahead at the curved wall of the chamber. It was made of some mineral that shifted color slowly, cycling between deep blue and pale gold depending on the light source. I had spent 6 years staring at that wall. I had memorized every shift in its color the way a person memorizes the face of someone they love or someone they fear. "I know that too," I said. Oliver sat back. He had worked with me long enough to understand that when I said I knew something, it was not the same as saying I did not care. It meant I had already planned for it. The clause in question was called the Developmental Alignment Protocol. The name sounded almost kind, almost reasonable. It was written in the careful language that powerful civilizations use when they want to do something that sounds acceptable but is not. What it meant, stripped of the diplomatic phrasing, was this: any member of the Galactic Conclave that fell below a specified technological index would be reclassified as an observer nation. Observer nations could attend sessions. They could not vote. They could not propose motions. They could not hold committee chairs or block resolutions. Humanity had joined the conclave 11 years ago. Our technology index was improving, but we were still below the threshold. We had been below it every year since we arrived. The threshold, as it happened, had been carefully calculated so that only one current member nation fell below it. Just us. I had read the original draft of this clause 8 months ago, in a document that I was not supposed to have access to. The document had been passed between 3 senior members of the bloc in an encrypted format. The encryption had taken our intelligence team 4 days to break. When I read the finished translation, I sat alone in my quarters for a long time and did not speak to anyone. Not because I was shocked, because I was deciding what to do about it. Delegate Voron called for the first round of speaker registrations. Delegates rose from across the room, their translator badges chirping softly as they registered their intent to speak. I counted 12 speakers from the bloc, 5 from the Solving Collective alone. They had rehearsed this. They were going to talk this clause into existence with the confidence of people who had already won. I did not register to speak. Oliver watched the registration board with growing tension. I could see his jaw tighten. He was a good man, Oliver, 31 years old, from Bristol, with a careful, precise mind and a deep, genuine belief that the right argument delivered at the right moment could change almost anything. He had been chosen for this assignment because he was brilliant. I had kept him because he was honest even when honesty was inconvenient. "They're going to open the floor," he said. "Yusra, if you're going to register." "Not yet." The first speaker rose. It was Delegate Shemka of the Vrethkai Empire, a broad creature with layered scales that changed color when emotion moved through them. Shemka's scales were a steady gold. That was Vrethkai for confidence. He spoke for 9 minutes about the importance of maintaining standards within the conclave. He used the word maturity 7 times. He never once said the word human. He did not need to. I watched him the way I had learned to watch all of them, not just listening to the words, watching the pauses, watching which delegates shifted in their chairs when he made certain points, watching who looked at their neighbor and who looked at the floor. I had been doing this for 6 years. I had filled 43 private journals with observations. I could read this room the way a navigator reads a star chart. The second speaker took the floor, and the third, and the fourth. The arguments were smooth and well prepared. Each one added a new layer to the same simple idea. Standards matter, the conclave must protect its integrity, this is nothing personal. Delegate Aleph of the Solving Collective used the phrase "in the spirit of cooperation" 4 times in 5 minutes. I had noted that phrase before. The Solving used it specifically when they were doing something that had no cooperative spirit in it at all. Halfway through the 5th speaker, Oliver slid a handwritten note across the table to me. It read, 37 confirmed. They have more than they need. If you move now, there's still time. I folded the note and placed it in my jacket pocket. Then I picked up my stylus and wrote one word on my notepad and turned it so Oliver could read it. It said, "Wait." He closed his eyes briefly. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The thing about waiting is that most people cannot do it. Not really. They think they can, but the moment pressure arrives, the moment something important is at stake, they break. They speak too soon. They reveal what they know before the right moment. They flinch, and flinching costs them everything. Humanity had been waiting for 6 years. 11 if you counted from the day we first arrived. We had sat in this chamber and absorbed every dismissal, every condescending glance, every casual remark about our species being too young, too fragile, too small to matter. We had watched species half our age receive respect that we were never offered. We had listened to our civilization described as developing, as promising, as an interesting experiment. We had written it all down. Every word, every slight, every alliance formed in whispers and every deal made in the quiet rooms behind the main chamber. We had cataloged it, cross-referenced it, and filed it away in secure storage that no conclave member knew existed. Because here was the truth that no one in this hall had bothered to consider. When no one is watching you, you can watch everything. And we had. The 6th speaker took the floor and began to speak. I picked up my stylus again. This time I was not writing a note. I was calculating timing. The motion would come to a procedural vote in approximately 17 minutes. Before that happened, the floor would be opened for final objections. That was my window. Not before, not a single second before. Oliver was watching me with the particular expression of a person who is trying very hard to trust someone and finding it expensive. I gave him nothing. No nod, no reassurance, no signal. He would understand everything in 17 minutes. The chamber moved through speaker after speaker. The air felt different to me now, sharper somehow. The way the air feels different when you step outside before a storm. The great shifting wall behind the speaker's platform was cycling toward gold. In conclave tradition, gold light meant a vote was approaching. I counted down quietly in my own mind. 14 minutes. 11. 9. My hand rested on the table, completely still. 7 minutes. Delegate Voron raised his arm, and the room began to settle into the particular silence that precedes a formal motion. I stood up. The silence in the room changed quality immediately. It went from the silence of anticipation to something else entirely. Something closer to the silence that falls when a predator steps unexpectedly into a clearing, and no one is sure yet what it intends. 214 delegates looked at me. Some of them, I knew, had never actually looked at a human directly before. We had been furniture in this room for so long that they had simply stopped registering us as participants. Delegate Voron recovered quickly. He was a skilled diplomat. "The Earth delegation," he said, his translator making the words clean and neutral. "This is unexpected. Earth has not registered to speak." "But I am registering now," I said. There was a procedure for floor registrations at this stage. Voron could not deny me without breaking 3 separate rules of conclave order, and every delegate in the room knew it. His bioluminescent markings dimmed very slightly. Not much, just enough for me to notice. "The floor recognizes Commander Yusra Khalid of Earth," he said. I took a slow breath. "Thank you," I said. "I will be brief." I looked out at the room. All those faces, those scales, those compound eyes, those layered membranes and bioluminescent patterns and color-shifting skins. Every single one of them watching me with some version of the same expression. Curiosity, suspicion, and just beneath both of those, a small and growing unease. "Good. I have listened to this discussion with great interest," I said. "And I want to say, before I begin, that I have tremendous respect for this body. Humanity joined the Galactic Conclave because we believed in what it was supposed to represent. We still believe that, which is exactly why I am standing here today." I paused for exactly 3 seconds. "I would like to ask Delegate Shemka of the Vrethkai Empire a direct question." Shemka's scales shifted, not gold anymore, something between gold and a pale, uncertain green. "Delegate Shemka," I said, "could you please explain to the chamber why the Vrethkai fleet projection submitted to the Conclave Defense Review last year listed 412 active warships in the outer corridor?" The room was absolutely silent. "Because," I continued, "the actual number, as verified by independent observation logs that my team has been quietly compiling for 4 years, is closer to 290, and most of those have not performed a live operational exercise in over a decade." Shemka did not move. His scales had gone completely pale. I looked slowly around the room. "I have more questions," I said, "but I think we should take them one at a time." And the Galactic Conclave, for perhaps the first time in its 400-year history, had absolutely nothing to say. I sat back down, folded my hands on the table and waited. I had always been good at waiting. The room did not recover the way a room normally recovers after a surprising moment. Usually there is noise, overlapping voices, delegates leaning to consult with their aides, the low mechanical hum of translator badges processing rapid speech. All of that happened, but underneath it there was something else, something I had not expected to feel so strongly. A charge in the air, like the moment before a power circuit closes and current begins to flow. I had started something. I had started it very deliberately, and I could not stop it now even if I wanted to. I did not want to. Oliver was completely still beside me. He was not writing. He was not checking his notes. He was simply watching the room unfold with the focused expression of someone watching a building they have always believed was poorly constructed begin to show its cracks. Delegate Voron called for order 3 times before the noise began to subside. I noticed that his bioluminescent markings, the long curving lines that ran from his collar to his temples, had shifted from their usual cool blue to a deeper, more muted tone. I had spent a long time learning to read solving bioluminescence. That particular shade meant stress. Not fear, not yet. Stress. I filed it away. Shemka of the Vrethkai had not spoken. He had not moved since I sat down. His scales remained pale, the Vrethkai equivalent of a person going white. I had known Shemka for 6 years. I had watched him walk into this chamber with the absolute confidence of someone who had never once been surprised in a formal setting. That confidence was gone. What replaced it was calculation. I could see it. He was running numbers, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much I could prove and what the gap between those two things might cost him. I could have told him the gap was very small. Voron's voice cut through the settling noise. The chamber will come to order. Commander Khalid, you have made a direct claim concerning the military data of a member nation. I must remind you that this claim requires formal verification through the Conclave Evidence Protocol before it can be entered into the record. Of course, I said. I am prepared to submit the full observation log today. It runs to approximately 900 pages. I can also provide the methodology used to compile it if the chamber would find that useful. There was a long pause. 900 pages, Voron said. Yes, give or take. Another pause. Somewhere to my left, I heard a delegate from one of the smaller border nations make a sound. It might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. This is highly irregular, Voron said. I agree, I said. Irregular things sometimes need to be said. I was being polite. I was being measured and respectful and careful with my tone. That was intentional. I did not want to look like someone attacking. I wanted to look like someone telling the truth. There is a difference, and experienced diplomats know it immediately. The delegates in this room were very experienced. They were watching me the way you watch a card player who has just flipped a card you did not know was in the deck. They were wondering what else I was holding. The answer, of course, was quite a lot. But I was not going to play every card at once. That was not patience. That was just strategy. Delegate Voron called a brief procedural recess to consult with the Conclave Legal Standing Committee. 7 minutes. I used those 7 minutes to go over the next sequence in my mind. I did not speak to Oliver. He did not speak to me. He was writing quickly on his pad, updating our internal probability calculations in real time, adjusting the models we had spent 4 years building. When the recess ended, Voron returned to his position with the careful, composed expression of a man who has just been told something he did not like. The Standing Committee has confirmed that Commander Khalid's claim is admissible under Conclave Procedural Rules, Section 41, Paragraph 3, he said. The evidence submission may proceed. However, I must note for the record that the Developmental Alignment Protocol motion remains on the agenda for this session. Of course, I said, I would not want to interrupt the agenda. I said it simply. No edge in my voice, no visible satisfaction, but the room heard what was underneath the words. The motion that had been moving so smoothly toward a vote 20 minutes ago was now sitting in a very different atmosphere. Every delegate who had planned to vote in favor was now doing a rapid private calculation. If Earth has 900 pages on the Vrethkai, what might they have on us? The answer in most cases was quite a lot. I had not opened the main file yet. I was not going to open it in pieces. That was not the point. The point was not to destroy anyone. The point was to make every member of this chamber understand, fully and permanently, that Earth had been paying attention. That we had always been paying attention. While they had been talking over us and around us and through us, we had been in the corners of every room, reading the documents that were left carelessly on tables, and memorizing the conversations that people have when they think the quiet ones are not listening. Nobody had ever thought to watch the humans. We were too new, too small, too unimportant. It was the most useful thing anyone had ever done to us. Delegate Aelith of the Solving Collective requested the floor. Voron granted it. Aelith was one of the smoothest speakers in the conclave, a creature with a calm, almost musical way of delivering even difficult messages. She was also, as I knew very well, one of the 3 architects of the Developmental Alignment Protocol. We appreciate Commander Khalid's contribution to this session, Aelith said. However, the Standing Committee's review of the Vrethkai data will naturally take some time. I wonder if we might proceed with the scheduled vote while that review is conducted. The 2 matters are unrelated. It was a good attempt, clean, professional, and almost convincing. With respect, I said, before Aelith had fully sat down, I believe the matters may be more related than they appear. Aelith paused. Could the commander clarify? Certainly, I said. The Developmental Alignment Protocol uses a technological index to define membership status. I am simply noting, for the record, that the data submitted by multiple member nations to support that index may benefit from careful review before we proceed. I would not want the conclave to make a permanent decision based on figures that might require correction. I said it calmly. I said it the way a person states a simple and obvious fact. Across the room, I watched the reaction move through the chamber like a visible wave. The delegates from the 7-species block exchanged glances, not the confident, coordinated glances of people executing a plan. The careful, sideways glances of people who had just realized their plan was standing on uncertain ground. Oliver slid his pad to me under the table. The screen showed our updated vote count projection. The block's confirmed number had dropped from 37 to 31 in 7 minutes. I slid the pad back without changing my expression. What happened next was not loud. It was not dramatic in the obvious sense. It was the sound of a room full of very powerful beings quietly revising their understanding of a situation they thought they had controlled. Delegate Voron called on Delegate Ferric of the Pelhari, a small, reserved nation from a single moon near the outer boundary of conclave space. The Pelhari were one of the most consistently overlooked members of the conclave. They had been observers in practice, if not in name, for 40 years. Ferric almost never spoke in open session. Today Ferric stood, and his voice was surprisingly steady. The Pelhari delegation, Ferric said, would like to formally support Commander Khaled's request for a full data review before the vote proceeds. That was the first domino. Delegate Oren of the Karasi followed 30 seconds later, then Delegate Mala of the Thresh territories. Each of them was from one of the smaller, quieter nations that had spent years being managed rather than represented. Each of them spoke briefly, without flourish. They were not making speeches. They were making a record. I had spoken with each of their delegations privately over the past 3 weeks, not to demand anything, not to promise specific rewards. I had simply shared information with them, freely and completely, told them what I knew about the debts being held over their governments, about the resource agreements that had been rewritten without their full understanding, about the decisions made in their names by larger powers who had not asked for permission. I had given them facts. I had let them decide what to do. They had decided. The block's number dropped to 26, then to 22. Delegate Voron called for another recess, and this time it lasted 22 minutes. When he returned, his bioluminescent markings had shifted again, now cycling between the muted stress tone I had noted earlier and something new. Something that read, in my notes from years of study, as resignation. He announced that the vote on the Developmental Alignment Protocol would be postponed pending a full data verification process. It would never come back to the floor. I knew that before he finished the sentence. The block's window had closed. They had built their strategy on a room they thought they understood. They had forgotten to account for the possibility that the quietest person in that room had been the most attentive. That was a costly thing to forget. When the session finally closed and the chamber began to empty, I sat still for a moment. Oliver let out a long, slow breath beside me. 900 pages, he said quietly. 912, I said. I rounded down. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when did you know this would work? I thought about that honestly. I knew we had the information. I did not know the room would move the way it did. That part involved guessing. You did not look like you were guessing. No, I said, I did not. That was the other thing I had learned in 6 years of silence. When you finally speak, you speak as though the outcome is already settled. Not because you are certain, but because certainty is the one tone that other people find very difficult to argue with. I gathered my materials, stood up, and walked toward the exit. Delegates moved aside as I passed. Not dramatically, just slightly. The small unconscious adjustment that people make when they are recalculating someone's position in a room. We had been invisible for a long time. That was over now. I did not know yet whether that was fully a good thing. The allies we had made today were genuine. I believed that. But the enemies we had made were also genuine. And enemies made in rooms like this one tend to have long memories and patient plans. I had a long memory too. And I was not done yet. The message came at 2:30 in the morning. Not an official channel. Not a formal diplomatic relay. It came through a private encrypted line that only 12 people in the entire conclave building even knew existed, and it came from a sender address I recognized immediately. It was from Delegate Aelith, the Solving. I read it standing in the small corridor outside my quarters, still fully dressed because I had not yet managed to sleep. The message was 4 lines. The first line asked for a private meeting. The second line named a time. Tomorrow, early morning before the chamber opened. The third line named a place, a neutral conference room on sublevel 4, which no delegation officially claimed. The fourth line was the one that kept me awake for the rest of the night. It said, "We know what you have not yet used. We would like to discuss terms." I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to 2 people only. The first was Oliver. The second was Dr. Claire Hopper, our intelligence coordinator, currently stationed on Earth but connected to our network at all times through a secure link that had never once been detected in 4 years of operation. Claire's response came in 6 minutes. It said, "They know about the secondary file. We need to decide how we want this conversation to go." I typed back, "I will handle it directly." A longer pause, then, "Be careful." I put the communicator away. I looked at the wall of the corridor for a moment. It was bare and gray, nothing like the grand shifting mineral of the chamber above, just metal and time. The secondary file was the part of our intelligence archive that I had not touched in the session. The part I had not even referenced. It contained everything we had gathered on the Solving Collective specifically. The debt manipulation schemes that had quietly absorbed the financial independence of 3 border nations, the covert resource extraction agreements signed under pressure, the internal communications that showed how deliberately and carefully it had all been planned. It also contained something else, something we had found 8 months ago that was larger than financial manipulation, something that the Solving had not yet realized we possessed. I had not used it in the session because I had not needed to. The Vrethkai data had been sufficient to shift the room. Bringing out the Solving file would have been unnecessary, and unnecessary actions in diplomatic settings have a way of creating consequences you did not plan for. But Aelith's message suggested that the Solving had been watching our archive more carefully than I had assumed. They knew we had something. They did not know exactly what. That uncertainty was making them move first, and moving first told me everything about how worried they were. I went back into my quarters, sat at the small desk by the window, and began to prepare for the meeting. Preparation for me did not mean compiling more data. I had the data. Preparation meant thinking very carefully about what the other person in the room would want, what they would fear, and what they were actually capable of doing when those 2 things came into conflict. Aelith was a sophisticated diplomat. She had been operating in the conclave for longer than I had been alive. She had built systems, managed alliances, and navigated the kind of complex multi-party politics that would have overwhelmed most people within a week. She was not someone who made careless moves. The fact that she was reaching out privately before any formal process had begun meant that she was trying to get ahead of something. She wanted to negotiate before I decided whether negotiation was the better option or whether releasing the file was. That told me the file was very damaging. I already knew that, but having it confirmed by the behavior of the people named in it was useful. Oliver arrived at my door at 6 in the morning, looking like he had slept about as much as I had. I handed him the printed summary of the solving file, the sections relevant to the 3 border nations. He read it in silence. When he finished, he looked up. "You're going to meet with her?" "Yes." "What do you want from them?" I thought about that for a moment. The easy answer was leverage. Continued silence in exchange for specific behavioral changes. That was how these things usually worked. That was the traditional structure of a situation like this one. But I had been thinking about something different. "I want the 3 border nations to be released from their debt agreements," I said. "Formally, on the record. And I want it done in a way that does not look like coercion from us, because if it looks like coercion, it sets a precedent I do not want to set." Oliver was quiet. "I also want the solving to support the charter reform motion we are going to propose next week," I said. "They will hate that." "They will hate the alternative more," I said. He thought for a moment. "What about the larger material in the file, the thing from 8 months ago?" "That," I said, "stays in the file for now." "And if she pushes?" "Then I let her know it exists without telling her what it is, and I let her decide how much she wants to test that uncertainty." Oliver nodded slowly. He had worked with me long enough to understand how this kind of negotiation functioned, not on threats, on the careful management of what the other person knew and what they imagined. Imagination was often more powerful than evidence. Evidence was finite. Imagination was not. Sublevel 4 of the Conclave building was a quiet space. The corridors down there were used mainly for storage and mechanical systems, and at 6:45 in the morning they were empty, except for the soft hum of the building's climate controls. Aelith was already in the room when I arrived. She was seated at the far end of the small table, composed and entirely still, the way a person is still when they have been practicing stillness for several minutes before someone arrived. Her bioluminescent markings were dim and even. She had been controlling them deliberately. I noted that and sat down across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," I said. There was a pause. "You were very restrained yesterday," she said. "More restrained than I expected." "I try to be restrained when possible," I said. "It is usually more effective." She tilted her head slightly. "You are younger than most people in this building who play at this level." "I have had good teachers," I said. "Mostly you and your colleagues, if I am honest. I have learned a great deal from watching this room for 6 years." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. The solving did not smile the way humans did, but something moved in her face that I recognized after years of careful study as the equivalent. "Direct," she said. "When appropriate," I said. She placed her hands flat on the table. It was a solving gesture of formal opening, a signal that the next words were meant as the actual start of a real conversation rather than a preliminary. "What do you want, Commander Khalid?" I told her. I laid out the 3 conditions clearly and without embellishment: the debt releases, the charter vote, and the ongoing silence of our secondary archive, which I described only as containing material of significant sensitivity without specifying further. I watched her face as I spoke. Her markings did not change, which meant she had already anticipated at least 2 of the 3 conditions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The charter reform will affect solving interests significantly," she said. "Yes," I said. "It will affect them in ways that are legally and procedurally appropriate, which is different from harmful." "You make that distinction sound simple." "It is not simple," I said, "but it is real." Another pause, and if we agree, you retain the secondary file. "It exists," I said. "I cannot make it not exist. What I can tell you is that I have no interest in using it as a weapon. I have an interest in a conclave that works correctly. Those are 2 different goals, and only one of them requires me to release anything." She studied me for a long time. I held her gaze and did not fill the silence. Humanity has been very quiet for a very long time, she said finally. Yes, I said. That was a strategy. Yes. She looked at the table, then back at me. It was a very good one. I did not answer that. There was no answer needed. We both understood what had happened in the 11 years since Earth joined the conclave, and we both understood what it meant now. The world had not changed in one session of the chamber, but the room had changed. The way people thought about the seat where our delegation sat had changed, permanently and without possibility of reversal. We were not furniture anymore. I will bring your conditions to our internal council, Aelith said. I will have an answer within 48 hours. That is acceptable, I said. She stood, I stood. She moved toward the door, then paused. One question, she said. The secondary file. What is in it beyond what I already suspect? I looked at her carefully. I think, I said, that the more useful question is what you would like to make sure is never relevant. She was quiet for a moment, then she walked out. I stayed in the room for a while after she left. The hum of the building systems was steady around me. Somewhere above, the grand chamber was beginning to fill with delegates preparing for the morning session. Ordinary business, routine motions, the kind of work the conclave did every day. I pulled out my notebook and wrote one short note to myself. It said, Day 1. Because that was what it was. Everything before this had been preparation. Everything before this had been learning and watching and waiting for the moment when speaking would mean something real. Today was day 1 of what came next. I closed the notebook, put it in my jacket pocket, and walked back upstairs. There was a great deal of work still to do. The 48 hours that Aelith had asked for became 36. I was in the middle of reviewing survey data with Oliver when the secure message arrived. It was brief. It confirmed all 3 conditions. It included a proposed timeline for the debt releases and a draft statement of support for the charter reform. The language of the statement was careful and measured, designed to make the solving support look principled rather than pressured. I read it twice, handed it to Oliver, and said, Tell Claire it worked. He read it, a slow breath. This is real. It is real, I said. 3 nations free from debt agreements they did not choose, he said. That is not a small thing, Yusra. No, I said, it is not. But even as I said it, something in me was already moving forward. Because the debt releases and the charter vote were steps. They were important steps, but they were not the destination. The destination was a conclave that actually functioned the way it was supposed to function, where smaller nations were not quietly absorbed by larger ones, where data submitted for formal review was accurate, where the rules that everyone agreed to follow were actually followed. That was a much larger project than one negotiation in Sublevel 4. I knew that. I had known it for years. The work that was coming would be harder than anything I had done in 6 years of silence, because it would be done in the open. In the open, every move was visible. Every choice could be challenged. Every alliance we built could be identified and targeted by the people who wanted the old order to continue. Before the morning session began, I went to see Delegate Ferric of the Pelhari. His delegation occupied one of the smallest offices in the building. 2 rooms, barely furnished, with a window that faced an internal corridor rather than the exterior. The Pelhari had been assigned that space when they joined the conclave and had never been moved to better quarters. There had simply never been anyone to advocate for it. Ferric opened the door himself. He was shorter than me, with large, very still eyes that gave him a look of perpetual careful attention. I had always liked his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to see clearly in difficult conditions. Commander Khalid, he said, please come in. I came in. The office was clean and organized, every surface holding only what was necessary. Ferric had an assistant, A young woman named Polly Grant who had been placed with the Pelhari delegation as part of a cross-training program, and she nodded at me from the corner where she was working. Ferric offered me a seat. I sat. "I wanted to thank you for speaking yesterday," I said. "It mattered." He was quiet for a moment. "It was the first time in 40 years that we have voted against the bloc on anything significant," he said. "I know," I said. "Our council on the home moon debated it for 2 days before agreeing," he said. "There was concern that the consequences would be immediate and punishing." "There may still be consequences," I said honestly. "I want to be clear with you about that. Supporting the charter reform will make certain powerful members uncomfortable. They will look for ways to apply pressure." Ferric nodded slowly. "Yes, we are aware." "What I can offer," I said, "is this. You will not be facing it alone, and you will have access to our intelligence archive, the same access we extended before the session. Not as a tool for me to direct you with, simply as information, so that you can see clearly what is happening around you at all times." Ferric's still eyes studied me for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "Why does Earth do this? Share freely, ask for nothing specific in return." It was a fair question. I had been asked it before in different forms. I thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because we spent 11 years being given nothing," I said. "No information, no partnership, no genuine inclusion. And we watched what that does to a civilization. It makes you smaller. It makes you careful in ways that cost you more than risk would have. We do not want that for anyone else." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is a very human answer." "Probably," I said. "I mean it as a compliment," he said. I smiled. "I know." We talked for another 20 minutes. Not about strategy or politics. About his moon and about Earth, and about the strange particular experience of sitting in a room full of civilizations that are older and louder than yours and deciding, day after day, to keep showing up anyway. When I left his office, Polly Grant followed me into the corridor. "Commander," she said. I stopped. She was young, perhaps 24. She had the expression of someone with something important to say and not quite enough certainty about whether to say it. "Go ahead," I said. "I have been with the Pelhari delegation for 14 months, she said. "Before that I did 3 years at the Conclave Technical Office. I have watched a lot of sessions." "All right," I said. "I have never seen anything like yesterday," she said. "I just wanted you to know that. I think a lot of people in this building who are not important enough for anyone to care what they think. We all watched yesterday and we thought something was different." I looked at her for a moment. "It is different," I said. "I need people like you to help keep it that way." She nodded, and something in her posture straightened. I walked back toward the main corridor. The morning session was beginning in 40 minutes. I had 2 preparation calls to take, one with Oliver and one with a delegate from the Karasi who wanted to discuss specifics of the charter language before it was formally proposed. Outside the building's tall observation windows, the system star was rising. It was not Earth's sun. It never was. But I had learned to find it beautiful anyway, this foreign light that fell through foreign glass and landed on my hands every morning when I sat at my station in the grand chamber. I had spent 6 years watching that light move across the chamber floor. I had memorized its path the way you memorize a road you travel every day. Tomorrow it would move differently, not because the star had changed, because the room it fell into had changed. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The door to the main corridor opened, and I walked through it and into whatever came next, carrying everything I had learned in the long, quiet years, and every name of every person who had helped get us here, and the weight of the work that was still ahead and something else too, something harder to name. The Pelhari Council had voted for the first time in 40 years. Polly Grant had watched from a corner office, and felt something change. 3 nations were about to be freed from agreements they had never freely chosen. None of that was the end. None of it even came close to the end. But each of those things was real. Each of them had weight. Each of them was something that existed in the world now that had not existed 3 days ago. I had been quiet for a long time. For 6 years in this building, and for all the years before that when Earth had been learning what it meant to be the newest, smallest, least regarded voice in a very old and complicated room. I was not quiet anymore. And I was just beginning to understand the full size of what that meant. 3 weeks after the session, Delegate Farrick of the Pelhari sent me a message. It arrived at midday, and it was 3 sentences long. It said, "We have voted. We used our voice today for the first time in 40 years. We wanted you to know." I read it standing at my desk. Oliver was behind me, working through the preliminary text of the charter reform. The room was full of the small sounds of ordinary work, data terminals processing, the distant hum of the building's climate systems, Oliver's stylus moving across his pad. I read the message again, then a third time. Then I walked to the window. The view from our office had not changed. It was the same stretch of docking corridor and distant stars that I had looked at every morning for 6 years. But something in me was different when I looked at it now, and I stood there for a while just being aware of that. 6 years. 6 years of watching and learning and writing everything down. 6 years of sitting at a table where no one expected anything from me, where no one looked at my chair when decisions were made, where the question of what Earth thought was simply never asked. I had been 29 when I arrived at this posting. I had been young enough to find the invisibility painful, old enough to eventually understand its value. There had been nights early on when I had written in my personal journal about the frustration of being overlooked, about the feeling of sitting in a room full of powerful voices and having none of my own. I had not written like that for a long time. Because somewhere in the middle of those 6 years, something had shifted. The invisibility had stopped being something done to me and had become something I was choosing. That was a different thing entirely. That was agency. And once I understood it as agency, the frustration disappeared and what replaced it was something closer to focus. Pure, patient, absolute focus. My colleague Dr. Claire Hopper had visited the station once, 14 months ago, for a coordination review. She had sat across from me in the same Sublevel 4 conference room where I later met Aelith, and she had asked me a question that I had thought about many times since. She had asked, "How long can you sustain this?" Meaning the silence, meaning the discipline, meaning the daily practice of having something to say and choosing not to say it because the time was not yet right. I had told her I did not know, and that was true at the time. Now I knew the answer. As long as necessary. That was the answer. You sustain it as long as it needs to be sustained, because the alternative is spending your words before they can do anything real, and wasted words are the most expensive thing there is in a room like the Galactic Conclave. But here was the thing I had not known when Claire asked that question, the thing I had only begun to understand in the weeks since the session. Sustaining the silence had cost something. Not my confidence, not my resolve, but something quieter and more personal. Something that had to do with all the moments in 6 years when I had heard something said in that chamber that was unjust, that was cruel in its quiet procedural way, that had real consequences for real people and real civilizations, and I had written it down and filed it and kept my face neutral and waited. There were 3 nations under debt agreements that had been signed under pressure, and we had known about those agreements for almost a year before we used the information. A year. I had made the right strategic decision. I had not moved until the moment when moving would produce the maximum outcome. I understood that. I still believed it. But right and costly can be the same thing. Those two things do not cancel each other out. And I needed to be honest about that, at least with myself. Because if I was not honest about it, then the next time a situation like that arose, I might make a worse choice without knowing why. That was the thing about playing a long game. The longer the game, the more you had to carry. Every decision you made in service of the eventual outcome had a weight. The weight did not disappear when the outcome arrived. It stayed. And what you did with it after was a separate question from whether you had been right. Oliver set down his stylus. The RSC delegate confirmed. She will co-sign the charter language. Good, I said, still at the window. That gives us 7 co-signatories. We need 9 for the formal proposal. We will have them by Thursday, he said. Farrick confirmed the Pelhari this morning, and Delegate Rowe of the Marantha's system said yesterday he was close. I turned from the window. What is Rowe waiting for? He wants a private conversation with you first, Oliver said. Not about the charter specifically. He wants to talk about the Ethon. I paused. The Ethon theocracy was the part of this situation that I had not yet addressed publicly, and that was deliberate and complicated in ways that the solving negotiation had not been. The Ethon were the most respected voice in the conclave. They had held that position for longer than most current member nations had been spacefaring. Their authority was not based on military power or economic weight. It was based on the universal perception that they were principled, fair, and deeply committed to the ideals that the conclave was founded on. That perception was not entirely wrong, which was what made the other parts so difficult. The suppressed first contact signals had been in our archive for 8 months. 2 civilizations, small ones, pre-spacefaring, located within territory the Ethon held jurisdiction over. Both civilizations had been broadcasting for years. Both were completely unaware that anyone had received their signals. The Ethon had received them. The Ethon had not reported them to the conclave, as was required under the First Contact Disclosure Statute that the Ethon themselves had helped write 60 years ago. I had gone over this every way I could think of. The Ethon were not doing it from cruelty. I was fairly sure of that. The signals came from within a resource-rich region, and the most likely explanation was that acknowledging the civilizations would trigger a complex territorial and sovereignty review that the Ethon wanted to avoid for reasons that were practical rather than malicious. Practical and wrong were also not opposites. They could exist together. I had not brought the Ethon information forward in the session because I had not needed to, and because using it as direct pressure would have destabilized the most respected institution in the conclave at a moment when I needed the conclave to function. That was a judgment call. It was a call I had made and I stood by it. But it could not stay in the archive indefinitely. The 2 civilizations were still broadcasting. They were still unaware. That was not something I could file away forever. I needed to talk to the Ethon. Not in a session, not with evidence laid on a table. I needed to sit with their high delegate, a quiet and careful woman named Delegate Vale, and have a real conversation. Delegate Vale was someone I had watched for 6 years with great attention. She was not like Shemka or Aleph. She was not operating from ambition or from institutional self-preservation in the way that most senior delegates were. She was genuinely committed to the ideals she represented. I believed that completely. Which meant the conversation I needed to have with her was not a negotiation. It was something harder. It was telling someone you respect that they have made a serious mistake and asking them to correct it. Those conversations were harder than the ones in Sublevel 4. Strategies did not help much with them. You just had to walk in and be honest. Tell Rowe I will meet with him tomorrow morning, I said to Oliver, and send a meeting request to Delegate Vale, not formal, personal correspondence from me to her directly. Oliver looked up, the Ethon. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. That one is going to be different from the others. I know, I said. What do you need from me for it? I thought about that. Nothing, I think. I need to do that one without a strategy. He nodded slowly. All right. I went back to the window. The star outside was lower now, the light coming in at a different angle, long and golden across the floor. I thought about Delegate Ferrick and his 40 years of silence, and the message he had sent me 3 sentences long. I thought about Polly Grant in the corridor. I thought about Claire's question about how long you could sustain it, and my answer, and what it had cost. I thought about what it meant to have a voice in a room that had been built long before you arrived. The Pelhari had voted. 3 border nations were being freed. 7 signatures on a charter that would change the foundational rules of an institution 400 years old. An 8-month-old file about 2 unknown civilizations that still needed to be addressed, carefully and honestly, without using it as leverage. There was no clean ending to any of it. Real things did not end cleanly. They moved forward, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly, with setbacks and complications, and people who surprised you in both directions. That was fine. That was what real work felt like. The star outside the window continued its slow arc. I had not come here to win a session. I had come here because Earth had decided, a long time ago, that the Galactic Conclave mattered, and that anything that mattered was worth doing carefully and seriously and without shortcuts. We had been quiet for a long time. We had used that time well. Now we were going to use the time ahead even better, not from silence, but from everything the silence had taught us, from the discipline of watching before speaking, and the knowledge of what the room actually contained, and the understanding that power in a place like this does not come from being the loudest voice. It comes from being the most prepared one, from understanding the room better than anyone else in it, from knowing exactly when to wait, and exactly when to speak, and exactly what to say when the moment finally arrives. From sitting at a table where no one expects anything from you, for as long as it takes, and being ready when the moment comes. That was what humanity had learned. That was what we would carry forward. That was what we were just beginning to use.